Sometimes you take the work where you can get it. This is Sega Masters. Today we continue our tour of what I call the Summer of the Sega sequel. For our second stop, the spotlight once again shines on our favorite heroic fighter ship in Fantasy Zone The Maze. The third game in the Fantasy Zone series, which is also known as simply Opa-Opa in Japan. However, concerns about this entry's quality are raised right out of the blocks due to this rather ugly title screen that greets us upon booting the cartridge up. For many longtime Sega diehards, the name Fantasy Zone conjures up fond memories of a pair of shooters set in a cute psychedelic universe. Cute 'em ups, if you will. The first entry, a port of the original arcade game and one of Sega's earliest releases in North America, was an enjoyable romp in spite of its brutal difficulty. That was followed by the console exclusive Fantasy Zone 2, which came out a year later and was covered back in episode 42. It followed the basic formula of the first cart, yet also improved on the design with some new features, making it one of the top shooters on the Master System. With another Fantasy Zone game on tap, it's natural to expect a third shooter that takes the formula even further. The cart starts off by offering you a choice of the game's 7 worlds to start your shooting session at, and that's followed by a rundown of the upgrades you can possibly purchase in the preceding stage. But when you begin the actual game, this is what you're greeted with. Yes, instead of a third sugar-coated cute 'em up, the maze is in fact a maze game where you collect dots. A genre that was popular way back in the early 1980s thanks to the success of this arcade classic. For whatever reason, Sega felt the need to craft their own Pac-Man homage with Fantasy Zone characters shoehorned in, even though simple dot grabbers were pretty much a relic by the latter part of the decade. And the maze wasn't even the first seemingly random game the Sega icon was tossed into. Opa-Opa was also featured in Sega's Galactic Protector, which is essentially a 360 version of Missile Command that was never released in the Western market, mainly because it required a paddle control that also never left Japan. It was as if Sega struggled to figure out what to do with their mascot, other than simply put him in a third shooter. Anyway, back to today's game. You take control of Opa-Opa, who's essentially the Pac-Man of this dot grabber, as he flies through the twisting corridors and open spaces of each maze, trying to scoop up all the coins scattered about. A second player can help out as Opa-Opa's palette swap brother, Opa-Opa, for some simultaneous 2-player action. Playing the role of the ghost monsters are some of Opa-Opa's familiar foes who constantly emerge from a generator in the center of the screen to harass you. You need to avoid these foes since they can kill you with a touch, and Opa-Opa starts off unarmed. That's right, Opa-Opa doesn't even have his normal guns to begin with this time. On top of that, the generator will slowly build up energy as indicated by a red meter, and once it fully charges, more enemies will be spawned for you to deal with, unless you periodically fly over the generator to reset its energy. Fortunately, the coins you collect can be used to purchase the weapons and other upgrades that are displayed around each level for some much needed firepower. However, the upgrades are basically just like Pac-Man's power pellets, as they're only temporary and disappear after a few seconds. Collect all the dots and the remaining enemies are all converted to big coins that you can scoop up before the stage concludes. Then you're awarded bonus points based on how quickly you cleared the board before it's on to the next stage for more coin collecting. Each of the 7 worlds consists of 3 screens. However, Sega's idea of mixing Pac-Man and Fantasy Zone just doesn't quite pan out, mainly because the maze isn't all that exciting. This cart just feels too much like a throwback to an earlier era that doesn't quite fit in with the modern games that were populating the consoles at the time. Avoiding the creatures and grabbing coins over and over gets repetitive and tiresome in almost no time at all, though the 2-player mode is actually pretty fun for a while. It also doesn't help that in its default form, Opa-Opa moves too slowly across the screen, while the enemies are much faster and can easily overtake you, giving you little hope of evading them in the cramped confines of the maze. The weapons do give you a fighting chance, yet seem pretty weak as multiple hits are needed to blast most creepies. This can be a problem when you're flying right at an enemy hoping to dust it before you collide, but oftentimes you end up hitting it anyway. Once you complete all 3 screens in a world, you're treated to this short bonus stage, where you're stumbling around a basic maze in the dark trying to scoop up coins and are granted limited visibility. Fortunately, no enemies are present in these screens. Then it's off to the next world and another 3 screens. Other than an increase in difficulty, the core gameplay changes very little from the first stage to the last, with nothing to break up the monotony. Not even any of the intense battles with kooky looking bosses the Fantasy Zone series is known for. The colorful backgrounds are borrowed from the first Fantasy Zone game, which look okay but are mostly irrelevant since they're mostly obscured by the rather plain black mazes. Sega could have at least worked in some of the elements from the worlds each stage is supposedly set in. The rather small sprites are nothing eye-popping but still recognizable from previous games. The music also tries to sound like classic Fantasy Zone background tunes but doesn't quite succeed, and sound effects are just there as always. So Fantasy Zone The Maze isn't a real terrible game, but other than the Fantasy Zone elements, nothing separates this cart from other Pac-Man homages. It certainly won't entertain fans of the series who are expecting and deserved more cute-em-up action. Sadly, this cart would basically be Opa-Opa's swan song on the Master System. A proper Fantasy Zone sequel wouldn't appear until 1992, when Super Fantasy Zone was released on the Genesis, but only in Japan and Europe. Though it was introduced to North American gamers on the Wii Virtual Console in 2009. So unless you're a fan of the old school 1980s maze games, there's really nothing to recommend here.